$2.7 billion. That is how much frozen French fries Canada exported in recent years. 91% of those exports went to the United States. Let that number sink in. When you order fries at McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger King, or any other fast food chain across America, there is a better than 9 in 10 chance those fries came from Canadian potatoes processed in Canadian facilities. Not a significant portion, not a helpful supplement, the overwhelming majority. And now that supply is under threat, not because of crop failures or natural disasters, but because Trump's tariff chaos has forced Canadian potato processors to make a calculation: is the American market stable enough to bet their business on anymore? This is the story of how a vegetable most Americans never think about became the latest casualty in Trump's trade war, how the frozen French fry supply chain that feeds hundreds of millions of Americans is being reconsidered by Canadian companies, and how fast food chains are quietly realizing they built their entire business model on a supply relationship that Trump just destabilized. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you the real numbers behind Canadian potato exports, why American fast food cannot function without them, and what happens when the fries that define American dining are suddenly at risk. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Canada exported $3.7 billion worth of total potato products in 2023 to 2024. Of that total, $2.7 billion was specifically frozen French fries. Where did those fries go? 91%. $2.4 billion worth went to the United States. That represents the single largest bilateral food trade relationship most Americans have never heard of, but depend on daily. Break that down further and the numbers become even more striking. Canada exported $50 million in seed potatoes. 96% went to the United States. $493 million in fresh potatoes. 93% went to the United States. The pattern is consistent across every category Canada produces and America buys. But the flow isn't just one direction. The United States imports $456 million in potato products from Canada annually. 85% of total United States potato imports come from Canada. Here is what those numbers mean in practical terms. The United States potato industry and Canadian potato industry aren't separate entities competing against each other. They're deeply integrated parts of a single North American supply chain, where Canada specializes in certain varieties and processing, while the United States focuses on others. And Trump is about to blow up that integration with tariffs. Canada produced 5.8 million metric tons of potatoes in 2024. That production is distributed across the country, 34% in Atlantic Canada, 19% in Central Canada, and 48% in the Prairie provinces, primarily Alberta and Manitoba. Those Prairie provinces matter enormously for frozen potato products. Alberta accounts for 24% of total Canadian potato production. Manitoba contributes 21%. Prince Edward Island adds 20%. These regions have massive processing facilities operated by 3 companies: McCain Foods, Simplot, and Cavendish Farms. Over the last 7 years, these 3 companies invested hundreds of millions of dollars into expansions and new processing plants in Alberta and Manitoba specifically. Why? Because demand for frozen potato products was surging from United States quick service restaurants, and they needed more capacity to meet that demand. That investment created the production capacity that now feeds American fast food chains, but it also created leverage because if Canadian processors decide American markets are too unstable due to Trump's tariff threats, they can redirect that capacity to serve other customers. And American fast food chains cannot easily replace millions of metric tons of frozen potato supply. Trump threatened 25% tariffs on frozen, fresh, and seed potatoes from Canada, for an industry operating on thin margins where transportation, energy, and labor costs are already substantial. 25% tariffs would be catastrophic, but the real damage isn't just the tariff itself, the real damage is the uncertainty. When processors don't know if tariffs will be 10%, 25%, or 50% next month, when they don't know if Trump will cancel negotiations over a television advertisement, when they cannot count on stable access to American markets, they start making different business decisions. And that is exactly what is happening. According to reporting from April 2025, potato processors told farmers they need fewer potatoes for 2025. Contract negotiations reflect volume decreases driven by trade uncertainty. The tariff uncertainty is forcing processors to reduce their exposure to American markets at exactly the wrong time for United States fast food chains. Because while demand may be soft temporarily, the long-term trend is clear. North American frozen potato consumption is projected to grow at 1.5% annually through 2035, reaching 3.8 million tons. The United States alone consumed 2.8 million tons of frozen potatoes in 2024 to 88% of total North American consumption. That demand isn't disappearing, but the supply to meet it is being reconsidered because Trump made American markets unpredictable. So if Canadian processors are reducing volumes for American contracts, where is the supply going instead? The answer is exactly where you would expect. Asia. Canada exported 1.4 million tons of frozen potato products globally in 2024. While the United States remains the largest destination by far, Japan is already the second largest market for Canadian frozen potatoes. South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and other Asian nations represent growing demand. As middle-class populations expand across Asia, demand for Western-style fast food increases. That means demand for frozen French fries that meet quick-service restaurant standards. Canadian processors already have relationships with Asian buyers. They already understand the quality requirements. What they needed was a reason to prioritize Asian sales over American contracts. Trump gave them that reason. Every time he threatens tariffs, every time he creates chaos, every time he demonstrates that American markets cannot be counted on for stable long-term partnerships, Canadian processors make another call to Tokyo, Seoul, or Manila to discuss increasing volumes. The shift isn't dramatic yet. It doesn't need to be. Even a 5 or 10% reduction in Canadian frozen potato exports to the United States would create significant supply tightness for American fast food chains because domestic United States frozen potato production cannot easily scale up to fill gaps. The United States produced 2.2 million tons of frozen potatoes in 2024. Canada produced 1.8 million tons, but Canada exported 1.4 million tons, while the United States exported only 935,000 tons. The United States is increasingly a net importer of frozen potato products. That import dependence is almost entirely on Canada. 86% of United States frozen French fry imports come from Canada. The European Union provides 13%. There are no other significant suppliers, so when Canadian supply shifts even slightly toward Asian markets, American fast food chains face a problem with no easy solution. Let's talk about what this means for the chains Americans eat at every day. McDonald's alone serves approximately 69 million customers globally each day. A substantial portion order French fries, arguably the most iconic menu item the chain offers. Industry estimates suggest McDonald's United States locations alone serve millions of pounds of French fries daily. Wendy's, with its fresh cut fries, still depends on processed potato supply for consistency and quality control. Burger King, Five Guys, Shake Shack, Arby's, Culver's, every major chain has built customer expectations around reliable access to high-quality frozen French fries. Now imagine Canadian supply to the United States drops by just 10%, due to processors redirecting volume to Asian buyers. Where do American chains source that 10%? Domestic production is already running near capacity, serving existing food service and retail demand. Building new processing facilities takes years and hundreds of millions in investment. European imports are possible but expensive. Shipping frozen products across the Atlantic costs far more than trucking them from Alberta to Montana. The likely outcome is straightforward. Supply gets tighter, prices increase, and fast food chains either absorb higher costs or pass them to consumers through menu price increases. In markets where customers are already price sensitive due to inflation, higher prices mean lost sales and reduced traffic. Or worse, supply constraints force menu limitations. Imagine McDonald's limiting fries to small sizes only during peak demand periods. Imagine Burger King implementing portion controls because supply is insufficient for projected customer volumes. These scenarios sound absurd until you understand that 91% of frozen potato imports come from a single source that Trump is actively destabilizing. But here is the crisis within the crisis that will take longer to manifest but could be even more devastating. Seed potatoes. Canada exported $50 million in seed potatoes in 2023 to 2024. 96%, $48 million, went to the United States. Seed potatoes aren't optional. You cannot plant commercial potato crops without certified seed stock that is disease-free, genetically suitable for specific growing regions, and optimized for processing requirements. Canadian seed potato producers, particularly in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Alberta, Manitoba, and Quebec, supply the majority of seed potatoes that United States farmers depend on. If tariffs disrupt seed potato trade, it doesn't just affect imports of finished frozen products. It threatens United States domestic potato production. Farmers cannot plant crops without seed. Reduced planting means reduced harvests. Reduced harvests mean less supply for American processors who are already facing Canadian import constraints. This is the nightmare scenario. Tariffs hit Canadian frozen potato imports immediately, reducing supply to fast food chains. Simultaneously, tariffs disrupt seed potato imports, reducing United States domestic production for future crop years. The entire supply chain gets hammered from both ends, and seed potato trade is particularly sensitive to timing. Planting windows are narrow based on climate and growing season. If seed shipments get delayed by tariff disputes, farmers miss planting windows entirely. That means zero production for that year. Canadian seed producers understand this vulnerability. If American markets become unstable due to Trump's chaos, they can explore partnerships with other countries that need high-quality seed potatoes. Mexico, South American nations, emerging markets in Asia. The relationships that have made United States potato farming viable for generations could be redirected, because Trump could not maintain a stable trading relationship. Here is what keeps procurement executives at major fast food chains awake at night. This isn't a temporary disruption they can wait out. This is the beginning of a structural shift in how Canadian potato processors think about their business. For decades, Canadian processors could assume American markets were stable, predictable, and growing. They invested hundreds of millions in capacity specifically to serve United States quick service restaurants. Those investments made sense because the trading relationship felt reliable. Trump destroyed that reliability. Now Canadian processors are asking themselves, do we want 70%, 80%, 90% of our business dependent on American markets that could face arbitrary tariffs at any moment based on a president's social media impulses? The rational answer is no. Diversify. Build relationships with Japanese buyers. Expand partnerships in South Korea. Explore opportunities in Southeast Asia. Reduce American market exposure to a level where Trump's chaos cannot threaten business survival. Once that diversification happens, once Canadian processors sign multi-year contracts with Asian buyers, once they invest in logistics infrastructure to serve Pacific markets more efficiently, those changes persist long after Trump leaves office. Because business relationships and supply chains are sticky, they don't reverse. Just because political winds shift, American fast food chains are beginning to understand this reality, and it terrifies them because they built their entire business model, their menus, their pricing, their customer expectations, on the assumption of reliable access to Canadian frozen potato supply. That assumption is now in question. This potato crisis isn't isolated. It is part of a broader pattern where Trump's chaotic trade policies are forcing Canadian industries to reduce dependence on American markets. We've seen it with aluminum, critical minerals, agricultural products. Potatoes are just the latest example, but they're a particularly vivid example because they affect something so visible and ubiquitous: fast food. When McDonald's potentially faces French fry supply constraints, when Wendy's has to pay premium prices for frozen potatoes, when Burger King considers menu adjustments due to supply uncertainty. Americans notice. And they should notice, because this is what happens when political leaders treat trade relationships as weapons rather than partnerships. When you threaten allies with tariffs to score political points, When you create chaos that makes long-term business planning impossible, when you treat sovereign nations with contempt, those nations respond by building alternatives. Canada is building alternatives, and American fast food chains are about to discover that the fries they took for granted are not guaranteed. Canada still produces 5.8 million metric tons of potatoes annually. McCain Foods, Simplot, and Cavendish Farms still operate massive processing facilities in Alberta and Manitoba. The frozen French fries that Americans eat every day are still being made. They're just increasingly being shipped to Tokyo and Seoul, instead of to McDonald's in Ohio and Burger King in Texas. The supply exists. American fast food chains are just no longer the guaranteed customer. And they can thank Donald Trump for turning the most reliable potato supply relationship in North America into something that processors now view as a risk to be managed, rather than a partnership to be maintained.